Hi guys, and welcome back to another video on the channel where we're going to be talking about the latest news with Edu. And is he signed? Is he going to sign for, well, I was going to say Forest, but the Marinakis company? And who better to ask than the main man himself, Ben Jacobs, who just a fountain and source of knowledge. If you're not following him, why not? He's over on X or Twitter or whatever it's called. It's in the description. Make sure you show him some love. Well, Ben, pleasure as always to have you on, mate. How you doing?
Good to be back. I mean, if you're not following me, it's probably because, as we said last time, I'm a Leicester fan and this is a Forest podcast.
Yeah, but we have mutual respect. You know, we're
That's
doing
true.
well. Cooper's on his way out soon, probably for you guys. But yeah, so interesting times.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of torn because if Leicester stay up, then Steve Cooper's done a good job. And at the moment, as a newly promoted side, it's the international break and we're not in the relegation zone. But it's just one of those strange Premier League seasons where if you aren't inspired by the manager, and even if we've done, say, the opposite of the Wolves and picked up a few more points, and
Mm.
they probably played better than Leicester and got less points, there's just that nagging doubt or that pang of pessimism that makes you think to yourself, if we go on a little rot around the festive period, then will we still be slightly above that drop zone? So he is under a little bit of pressure, Steve
Mm.
Cooper, but my personal belief is to start talking about him being replaced at this stage, it just feels a bit premature.
I'll leave that for the Leicester fans to discuss. What I want to talk about, mate, is Edu and this impending move to the Marinakis. I don't know what we call it, family, corporation, whatever it might be. I just really wanted to touch base as we record now. Like, what's the current state of play with Edu? Is he signed? Is there an offer on the table? Where are we with things?
There's an offer on the table and there's some kind of verbal agreement over the role. And Edu, after resigning, has what's understood to be a 6 month period of gardening leave as well. That's not to say that
Okay.
he can't line anything up or agree anything. But when you become available on the market, which was a surprise to a lot of people, as you can imagine, he won't only have one job offer. So even if he agrees the framework of something with Marinakis and the multi-club group of which Nottingham Forest are a part of, I would expect other people to at least be sounding Edu out. And therefore, no cause for panic at this point about a sort of hijack offer. But until it's signed, it's certainly not done. And at the time we're recording, let's see if that changes, for example, during the international break. But as we're speaking now, it's not signed. But what it is agreed in terms of the scope of the role, the freedom and power that would come with it to work across the multi-club group, and in addition to the financials, which are understood to be a little bit more generous, if you like, compared to the
Mm.
terms that he was on at Arsenal, which is to be expected because this is not a like for like role. And people wrongly are painting it as Edu's leaving Arsenal for Nottingham Forest. He's not. He might be leaving for a multi-club role that's more like Michael Edwards, so CEO of football or whatever title, if he joins, they determine. And therefore, the scope, the role, the power, the pay, it's all basically a promotion from Arsenal. And Nottingham Forest, should he take the job, will only be one part of his day to day, in the same way that Michael Edwards is not Liverpool, he's FSG.
Yeah. So can we just clarify, because there has been, I think, misinformation on this. He has not left Arsenal because of Forest or the Marinakis offer. Are those two separate? Because we did hear reports coming out from Brazil back in August, I think it was, that there was talks that Marinakis wanted Edu and there was a lot of courting going on. But the reason he's left Arsenal, just to confirm, is not because of this, is it?
No, I think it's linked, obviously. And Edu knows that one, he's not going to be short of job offers. Two, he
Mm.
does have a job offer tabled from Marinakis. So it is most likely at the time we are recording that that is the one he'll take because they've agreed the framework. But the door is always open because somebody like that will be in demand. Now, how many multi-clubs are out there that may decide Edu is right for them? It's probably only Marinakis from the Premier League. Some will speculate, and I'm certainly not saying this is the case or there's any approach being made, but some will look at Chelsea and say generally within their model, there might be room one day for a group head of football or a CEO of football, someone to run the Blueco side. But the reason I want to be clear on this, why I'm not implying anything, is because there's been no outreach on that front from Blueco. They spoke to Michael Edwards many, many months ago. Then they determined that they were going to give their full backing to the two sporting directors, Lawrence Stewart and Paul Winstanley. And above them, you effectively have the ownership and Badad Eghbali in particular. So there's no suggestion that Chelsea, who like the Arsenal model, are looking at Edu at this stage. So we're not aware of any other rival job offers in terms of the specifics, but what sources do make clear is that Edu does have more than one opportunity, but this appears to be the leading offer. So is it directly linked? Well, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that if he wants to start in 2025, then he has to give his notice and serve out his gardening leave. Second of all, if you're Arsenal, regardless of where he goes, you don't want to leave him in situ. So the instant resignation is not actually always down from experience to your sporting director or a prospective club or group where they may go. It's often the actual club losing the sporting director that wants them immediately out the door because it's counterproductive to be sharing information and working towards future windows that you're not going to be a part of. So this is actually very common. I think back most recently to Dan Ashworth, who
Newcastle.
long before anything was agreed with Manchester United, immediately was placed on gardening leave by Newcastle. So I would have thought that it's an amicable exit, and it was very much Arsenal saying, okay, whether you join the Marinakis group or somewhere else, it's better that you go right now so all parties can move on. And from Edu's point of view, he can eat into that gardening leave. So it's not a case of he's signed, he said yes, he's moving over to the Marinakis group, and therefore he's chosen to give his resignation at Arsenal. But there is obviously a link between that very concrete job possibility and the fact that Edu has, within days of that developing, the courtship, like you say, dated back a little bit longer, but the days building up to the resignation were very much about the parties trying to come somewhere close to a verbal agreement prior to potentially signing. And at the same time, Arsenal learnt of that. They were slightly surprised by that. And now it's been decided that there's a clean break, regardless of whether it ends up being Edu that does decide to take that job.
So what's interesting there, Ben? So just to confirm, are you saying, let's say he signed tomorrow and agreed with Marinakis, that gardening leave, that's kicked in from the moment he's handed his notice, I assume, at Arsenal. So technically speaking, that was about, what, a week or two ago. Are you saying that he wouldn't be able to be actively or officially, should we say, involved in any of the Marinakis teams until 6 months from that period? Would that be correct?
Yes, a 6-month gardening leave. And because he's not gone to Arsenal with an offer, or ultimately it'd be Marinakis rather than Edu specifically, there's been no negotiation between Arsenal and the Marinakis group in relation to this role. And therefore, the point at which Edu gives his notice, he triggers an automatic non-compete 6-month gardening leave. Now, whether it's Marinakis or whether it's another job offer, anybody could, in that gardening leave, when he's still being paid by Arsenal, go back to Arsenal and try and negotiate to get a shorter period. So that we're going to have to wait and see. It's not that it's definitely locked in at 6 months minus however many weeks it's been. It's the fact that somebody would have to negotiate with Arsenal and see whether there is a compensation package, in the same way that Dan Ashworth had a long gardening leave and eventually Manchester United made a relatively healthy payment, but nowhere near the 20 million that Newcastle were originally asking for. And that partly because of Newcastle's financial need and desire around the PSR deadline to bring in money resulted in Ashworth being able to start last summer, when originally it looked like he would also have to serve a much longer period of his gardening leave.
Interesting. Okay. And in terms of what you understand about the job role or potential job role, obviously it will still be loose and speculative. But what's your understanding of the framework of how he would fit into the organization and his role? You touched on it wouldn't be a sporting director role, as such. It would be an overview, would it be, of the group?
Yeah, I think we're looking very similar scope to Michael Edwards at FSG. So I'm not saying it will specifically be titled this way, but CEO of football or group head or global head of football or global sporting director, all of these kind of titles effectively mean the same thing.
Mm,
And the appeal for Edu is effectively at having football and business control and club input and also a group say, because multi club is deemed to be the future of where football is heading. And then with Michael Edwards, he originally turned down a return to working with FSG and ultimately Liverpool as well, because he didn't just want to be somebody that was across signings. He wanted to be somebody across strategy. And Edu is believed to be the same as well. So this role is going to have recruitment plus strategy, and it's going to have expansion, which is the other key point. And again, I come back to Michael Edwards because that's the mold and the model
yeah.
that a lot of clubs are looking to replicate. And this is how you get the real A-listers in the industry that effectively start in recruitment, but want a bit more than recruitment and don't only want to work across one club. And therefore, when you offer somebody that type of role, it's not only refreshing, but it's a promotion, and it gives them the kind of power that they are looking for to not just shape who you buy and sell, but shape the direction of strategy. So the third component is in that expansion of multi-club. And there's a lot of misinformation out there, and there's a lot of Edu leaving Arsenal for Nottingham Forest, or Edu leaving Arsenal to go and work across three clubs in Portugal, Greece, and England, when Arsenal are building this 5 to 10 year project and Edu and Arteta get on. What's going on? But the last aspect is the same for Michael Edwards as well, where Edu, if he takes this role, will be able to lead upon adding clubs to the multi-club network. And we know that that was a big lure for Michael Edwards as well. So Liverpool tried for Bordeaux, but they didn't think it was financially viable. And they're still
Mm,
looking for that second club to be part of the football network and connect to Liverpool. And what's sort of interesting in all of this is how that connection works. So if you look at Chelsea, it's very much Chelsea, and then with respect to Strasbourg, Strasbourg is below it in the sense that a lot of the Chelsea players go to Strasbourg. A lot of the philosophy of Chelsea gets filtered down to Strasbourg. So everything is still connecting back up to Chelsea, even though we should never say any club is sort of inferior because they're all
yeah.
competing in their own leagues. They're always going to be their own entity. But the strategy at Chelsea is mirrored at Strasbourg, and there will be an element of players filtering through Strasbourg back up to Chelsea, and the best practices and the consistency between those clubs have to be very similar. So that's one. Liverpool's philosophy, and it's why they didn't buy Bordeaux, was because they don't want that model. They want a standalone, historical, prestigious club that they can just build and succeed. Eventually, it will benefit Liverpool, but they're not looking at the two clubs in a as interconnected way as perhaps Chelsea and Strasbourg. So that's a little bit different. And then with Marinakis, one, you're looking at the fact that there's already more clubs. And two, I do think it likely that Edu or whoever comes in this role will be tasked with taking a flagship club in South America, because that's where there's a gap in the market. Greece, Portugal, England, South America. You have someone that's Brazilian. You have somebody that has a track record of working with, of recruiting young Brazilian talent. And if you have a big landing point somewhere in South America where you can keep the players, you can gain success within your own right and within your own league, but potentially still a chance to give them pathways and opportunities within Europe as well, if they so wish. That's a nice balance. And I think deep down, Edu's frustration at Arsenal was fantastic club, great infrastructure, but it's the nature, isn't it, when you're a big club, that if you go with young talent, you can't always throw them in at the deep end, and it's
Yeah.
going to be hyper competitive. And even at a club like Arsenal with a rich history of South American and particularly Brazilian talent, it's quite daunting, I think, if you're a teenage Brazilian star, and instead of saying, well, you can stay at your Brazilian club for 1-2 years, whether delayed signing or loan back, and then you can go off to Olympiacos, and then you can go off to Portugal or Nottingham Forest, depending on your pathway. And if it works, you'll end up in the Premier League. And if it doesn't work, then you'll end up somewhere in Europe. And if you're happy playing for a giant, should they buy one in, let's just call it Brazil, you can stay there as well. And it's win-win-win. And
Mm.
if you look at Arsenal's history of Brazilians, that's one thing. But if you actually look, and I suppose we ought to go a bit broader than just Brazilian, but if you look at a lot of the young movement of talent, many of them are joining clubs where they feel that there are those kind of pathways. Endrick was maybe an exception
Yeah.
because there was the prestige of just going to Real Madrid. But I think about the Chelsea model, and Arsenal were not really in the conversation, for example, for Esteval Willian, or if we move
Mm.
away from Brazil, Kendry Paez. You've got Andre Santos, very highly rated too, who's now at Strasbourg. And a lot of these teenage talents are saying, wait a minute, if we're going to move this early and we're not going to get that instant game time, how are we going to get the development? How are we going to get the security?
Yeah.
And how are we going to get the learnings and the minutes in Europe? And there's Chelsea that can say Strasbourg. There's Marinakis that can say, well, if it isn't Forest, I can send you to Portugal, to Greece, to whatever else they end up buying in the future. Savinho's another good example, came through City Football Group,
Mm.
now is off to a very positive start at Manchester City. And I think that is one of the big things within Edu's thinking at the moment, that if he's to have an impact on the development of Brazilian and or South American talent,
Yeah.
if he's to have control over a multi-club, if he's to have the ability to buy or lead the acquisition within South America, and if he's still got a landing point back in the Premier League through Nottingham Forest, that could all be very appealing. And I actually think if you sell it like that to any recruitment expert, whether it's Edu or whether it's somebody else, I think that would be seen as a very appealing job, just because of the depth and the power that is on show with that kind of role for whoever the successful candidate is.
If that was the sales pitch, I'm ready to sign up to that kind of job. I mean, they should have used you to do it if they're struggling to get him over the line. Wow, what a pitch that is. And just touching on that, because I did want to talk about the Brazilian side of things. There's been rumors and links to Edu about one of the clubs that he may be tasked with signing in terms of Vasco da Gama. I've probably butchered the name of the club there. Is there any strength in this? Any truth? Have you heard anything about this acquisition at all?
Well, this is only in the news really because of the 777 situation and
Mm.
a feeling that they'll be forced to sell assets or strip them. So there may be a market opportunity there. And of course, if you buy Vasco da Gama, then you have to look at that as kind of top of the pyramid or equal with Nottingham Forest. And I don't mean any disrespect to either club when I say that one might be bigger than the other. But if you look at Forest's history, it's illustrious. If you look at Vasca's history, it's illustrious. If you look at their following online, if you look at their squad talent, if you look at the Brazilians that are currently there, you can't buy a club like that if that is the direction of travel that they wish to go, and look at that as something that is secondary, even though in recent seasons they've not been able to kind of replicate their historical glory years. And it will kind of be interesting to see whether some kind of new owner is able to change that narrative.
Yeah.
But I think I'm right in saying, when you kind of look at their overall history, they've had 25, nearly 24, 25 titles, but their last one from memory for me was maybe 8 years ago. So anyone that comes in there is going to have to work out how to effectively restore the glory days. But you would definitely not look at that kind of club as a lower asset or property compared to Nottingham Forest. But what it gives you is a real point of difference, because as I said before, the vast majority of the Vasca squad are Brazilian. And therefore, if you have young Brazilian talent, you can keep them there, you can develop them there. And this is maybe something, if you do have somebody like Edu, that you kind of have a win-win scenario with. One, because he has that relationship with players, he played himself. Two, because he understands the culture and the football out there. Three, because young talent trust him. And four, because he wouldn't only be recruitment. So if you are going to try and buy a club like that, you can involve him in the process. It's too early to say whether that will be the club, and it's far too early to say whether Edu will at this point be directly involved, because if they did want that club and they're taking a opportunity due to the 777 situation, then my personal assumption would be that it's much further down the line, in which case Edu may actually not be able to pick or counter or come up with another option. So all I can really say at this point is it would make sense that somebody tries to make an offer for Vasca because of its history and its rich Brazilian talent, and because of the fact that there's a market opportunity there due to the 777 situation. But I'm not aware whether within any luring of Edu, anything more advanced between Marinakis and Vasca has actually been floated or mentioned at this stage.
Okay, very interesting. The last thing I want to touch on, mate, is just about the Brazilian connection that Forest currently have in terms of the recruitment we're doing. We're seeing the likes of Danilo coming through a season or two ago. Unfortunately, he picked up a nasty injury at the start of the season. And the likes of Murillo now, who's hopefully likes Liverpool and stuff, will stay away from him. I'm seeing links there. But do you think part of that law will be to continue that involvement? You've talked about how Edu is almost passionate about what happens with the South American talent coming through, and how Arsenal have been missing out on those signings in recent time. Do you see that as a positive for Forest, that Edu will have a passion for that and look to bring these emerging talents from South America through the hierarchy, if you like, as you described it?
Yeah, I think so. Ultimately, the young Brazilian talents that often get mentioned and hyped up are
Mm,
ones for the future. So they need
mm,
pathways. And it may be that signing them and chucking them straight into the Forest A team or B team is not really the direction of
yeah,
travel. And of course, in some cases, you have to think about whether they're visa eligible and so on. So I would
yeah,
certainly expect Marinakis, whoever comes in, whether Edu or someone else, to be looking at the full group rather than only thinking specifically about Nottingham Forest. But if you kind of look at some of the players within Forest B team, I'm thinking particularly Christian Fletcher, who's young
mm,
and on loan from DC United, or another player perhaps like Shay Cahill. Those are scouting successes where
yeah,
Forest have gone outside of the traditional UK market and said, how can we look a bit further afield? And it would be normal to start thinking about South America in that context, whether in the
yeah.
Forest under 23s, under 21s, or alternatively within the group, and then eventually back into the first team. And I suppose this isn't a new thing, and it's not necessarily a secret in the industry that everyone's looking to get all over South America. But perhaps the difference is a lot of the players in the past from, for example, Brazil, that Nottingham Forest have been linked with are maybe a little bit older. I remember Nino was one example, who's now at Zenit St. Petersburg, I think, when he was
Yeah.
at Fluminense. But there you're talking about a player that is in his mid to late 20s. You have got somebody like Morata, who I believe is 23, and Murillo, 22. And these obviously are not old footballers, but we're talking still about almost the
Yeah.
generation younger than them. And that's where there's the real battle at this stage. So,
Yeah,
yes,
because there's a
Forest.
rule, isn't there? Sorry to interrupt. There's a rule that they can't leave till they're 18, I think, if I remember
Exactly,
rightly,
but people
from
are
Brazil.
looking at them early now when they're
Like
16,
almost
17,
15. Yeah,
or
exactly.
18. But
And they
even within that
considered,
teenage
I
bracket.
remember with Danilo, the reason we got him cheaply was because he was getting towards that age where it was like maybe he's too far gone, even though he was about 20 when that was happening. It's fascinating, that
Yeah,
whole
and I mean,
market.
Forest have done very well to bring in these mid-20s or early 20s players because they've still got huge longevity, potentially
Mm,
7 or 8 seasons. So that's the kind of upside. And once you've got one or two Brazilians, it's a lot easier to persuade others, perhaps, that are wondering what it's going to be like because they walk into a dressing room where there's compatriots, where there's people they can
yeah,
speak the same language with, and so on.
yeah,
So these are all positives. But there is actually a big difference in your recruitment between 22, 23, 24, 25, where you would expect the player to have potentially
yeah,
played 70 to 100 games, but also you would feel like they're ready for whatever league they're joining. Very
yeah.
rarely do you sign a 23 to 25-year-old and say, we need 3 to 5 years more of development before you're
Mm,
going to see them. So
mm,
Forest have bought their Brazilians for the now, and all credit to them because many of them are having outstanding seasons so far, and that's definitely paying off. But if you just go back a few years and you look at that age bracket of 16 to 18, which, as you say, you have to wait till they're 18, but also
yeah,
18 to 21, it's that age bracket when they're
yeah,
eligible, when they're ready, when they're old enough, still late teens into early 20s. That's the most competitive. And if you get those players at the right age, that's also where you can get the most value because their wages
yeah.
might be a little bit lower. They may not have quite burst onto the scene. So that's the sort of next step in the recruitment. And then when you get that player, are they able to just burst straight into your first team still because they're an outstanding talent? Or is that when they go and do a year in Portugal or Greece? Or do they actually stay, if they do buy a club in Brazil, at their original club
Mm.
until they're perhaps 20 and then come to a club like Nottingham Forest? So it's a very difficult and transitional age group because, as I think I've said to you before, you are waiting for that final push of development. Everything from how they're
Yeah,
built to their intelligence on the ball to their tactical nous to their technique. There's still the room for improvement. It can be a gamble throwing them in at 19, 20 instead of 22, 23. So
yeah.
again, this multi-club model gives you a bit of security where you can watch them at another club at a slightly less standard, develop and grow. And then if everything goes according to plan, that's when you bring them back to Nottingham Forest with a bit more stability and security that they are going to be able to cut it at that level.
I'm excited. You made me very excited about this model, mate. It sounds good. I've spoken to a lot of Arsenal fans. Some are very positive about Edu, some not so much because they bring up some of the dud transfers he's had, etc. So, guys in the comments, let me know what you think about everything Ben said there. Can I ask you one final cheeky little question, Ben?
Go for it.
Murillo, is he staying?
Well, I think that's Forest's expectation. Of course, he's going to be in demand, but you may remember we spoke over the summer, and the
Yeah.
same kind of clubs were looking and circling. They've got no obligation to sell, and he's only been at the club for a season and a bit as well. So Forest
Mm,
have kind of got all the cards. The interest, which is reasonably well reported, is accurate from clubs within the Premier League and also within Europe as well. But at this stage, I'd be staggered, for example, if it was a mid-season exit. So I think you can
mm,
at least relax until next
good.
summer. And then a lot can also depend in these type of situations about where Forest are as well. It's one of those seasons where I think there's 3 points at the time we're recording between Brentford in 11th and Chelsea in third. And Nottingham Forest are obviously well within the top half of the table at the moment. And therefore, if the season goes according to plan and they have something positive, whether that's top half or whether that's better, you can build on that. But it's just one of those strange seasons where you win back-to-back games now, you probably be third in the table. You lose back-to-back games now, you probably fall down to 12th, 13th and start looking over your shoulder. And not that I'm saying in the imminent future, any one result or string of results is going to affect Murillo. But of course,
Yeah.
if you got to the end of the season and Forest were mid-table and he didn't think they were going to get better than mid-table, and someone comes and offers him Champions League football or something, you just never know. But Forest have got all the cards, he's well contracted, and therefore it's probably a conversation for a later day. And it is now just a key period for Forest anyway, because if we think more about the team than Murillo, can they kind of continue this run of strong away form, of perhaps picking up points in games where maybe last season fans would have felt they would have lost? Chelsea is a great example for me because it's an away point, it's a battling point. They were down to 10 men and they had 2 golden opportunities to win it late on, which sort of shows you how positive Nuno's trying to be. Forest last season would have probably just parked the bus in that game and lost it, or gone down to 10 men as they did and lost it. But it was a really good point on the road. And now you're going to Arsenal after the international break, and they're a bit hit and miss. Home game against Ipswich, which they absolutely have to win to keep building momentum, because then they got to play Man City away, Man United away, who under Amorim should by then, I think, be a relatively strong prospect. There's a derby of sorts, East West Midlands against Villa, and then you get into the festive period. So by mid-December, we're going to learn a lot more about what Forest are actually capable of this season. And of course, players themselves will think about where the momentum's going and what they're capable of. And then come summer 2025, that might inform their thinking. And that, unfortunately, is just football.
Yeah. So we just have to win top 4 or the league and he'll stay, guys.
Top half, I think. I don't think it's about Europe. I think it's about progress.
Yeah, I agree. And that pathway, as we've been talking about on this. Ben, it's been absolutely fascinating. As always, you've been more than generous with your time. Guys, the link's in the description. If you're not following Ben, make sure you are down below. And make sure you've hit that like button and subscribe here if you're new. Ben, thank you so much for your time, mate. And let's do this again soon. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Look forward to it. Good luck to Forest for the rest of the season, except against Leicester.
Yeah, 3-1, mate. 3-1. Cheers.